Well, despite citing no actual evidence, Republicans in the House are pressing ahead with their investigation of President Donald Trump for possible collusion with the state of Russia. David Brooks of the New York Times, who despises Trump and says so all the time, even he is getting suspicious of the whole enterprise. Here's what he said.
I'm actually getting more uncomfortable with this whole deal, thinking that maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. And I'm bothered by the lack of emerging evidence about the underlying crime, that there was actually collusion or coordination between the Trump White House. I'm just afraid we're being swallowed up by the politics of scandal when there's less and less evidence that they actually colluded. And maybe that'll come out, but so far it hasn't, and it bothers me.
So what is this investigation about, and when, if ever, does it end? Congressman Trey Gowdy just took over as chairman of the House Oversight Committee. He also serves on the House Intelligence Committee, and he joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks so much, Chairman. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, sir. Hope you're feeling better.
I feel vigorous.
Good.
But I have lost track of the point of all this. What is the point of this investigation, just to remind those of us who are following at home?
Well, Tucker, the hyper-focus on collusion is not Congress's fault. I would say folks in your line of work have been focused on collusion much more than certainly Republican members of the House. There are four things that we're looking at. Russian active measures, which a subset of that would be collusion. The U.S. response back in 2016, which has nothing to do with Trump. That's an Obama administration response. And then importantly, the leaks and the unmasking, which have everything to do with the reauthorization of certain surveillance programs. So there are four things that the House Intel Committee is looking at. One of those involves Russian active measures, and a subset of that would be collusion, not just between Mr. Trump and the Russians, but any American and the Russians. So the hyper-focus on collusion and conspiracy and coordination is not mine. I'm interested in all four tranches.
When will we know what happened? When will this wrap up, do you think?
When the last witness is interviewed, and that is a legitimate criticism. I was ready months ago. There are only 6 members of the House Intel Committee that are conducting the witness interviews. Only 6, so it's not the whole committee. I was ready 2 months ago to start interviewing witnesses. We are slowly beginning to do that. We have another one tomorrow. Our goal is to have this done in a perfect world before Labor Day. We've interviewed everyone, because keep in mind, if we don't interview every witness, then some skeptic's going to say the one witness you did not interview is the one that has all the knowledge. So you have to interview everyone, and then at the end you can discuss what evidence exists or does not exist.
So you said a minute ago the press was keeping the idea of collusion at the forefront of the public consciousness, which is, of course, true. I think you've been responsible in your public statements on this. We've had members of the committee on this show who have openly suggested, certainly implied, that there was collusion. There's clearly a political agenda here, and I'm not flacking for the Trump administration. Obviously, the president's hurt himself with his grotesquely counterproductive tweeting on the subject. But as a factual matter, there is a political agenda here, an axe being ground by Democrats, and doesn't that kind of color the whole investigation and make it maybe less useful from the public's perspective?
Well, it certainly may, the congressional part. I think Robert Mueller has a long, distinguished career that is essentially apolitical. And I think that people are going to be able to have confidence in the outcome of that investigation. With respect to Congress, we have a tendency to politicize almost everything, Tucker, and you're exactly right. There are members of both the House and the Senate who talk about, here's my favorite, I've seen evidence that's more than circumstantial but not direct, which, by the way, is tautological. There's no way it can be more than circumstantial but not direct. And then one of the members of the committee said this week that he has seen evidence. He can't tell us what it is. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no way to defend yourself against those kind of baseless, reckless accusations. So I think ultimately the public will have confidence in Robert Mueller's investigation. Whether or not they have confidence in Congress's investigation depends on how responsible we are and how we frame the issues.
So you've just taken over the chairmanship from Jason Chaffetz. How will the committee be different under you, under your leadership?
Well, there are 2 components to our committee, Tucker. There's oversight and then there's government reform. Oversight is always in fashion. It's always in style because of branch equity and branch equilibrium issues. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do the government reform that lots and lots of folks have been talking about for decades. So that's going to be my focus. It's going to be serious, reform-minded ideas that save money. That, you know, what frustrates people is when we have hearings on waste, fraud, and abuse, and then we do nothing about it. So I look for fewer hearings on waste, fraud, and abuse, and more work on it.
I got to say, I love the hearings, but I'd also like to see some action. I'm sure lots of our viewers agree. Mr. Chairman, thank you for coming on tonight. I appreciate
Yes, sir. Thank you, Tucker.
I wanted to ask Mr. Cohen this question. I'm holding a copy of a May 1, 2017 paper from the Southern Poverty Law Center, the title of which is "The Battle for Berkeley. In the name of freedom of speech, the radical right is circling the ivory tower to ensure a voice for the alt-right." Could you please describe for us the thrust of this paper and any comments you would care to make?
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. At Berkeley, and in particular, as protests have escalated, so has the presence of groups that really have violence on their minds. We've had the kind of anti-fascist descend on Berkeley, and in response to them, we've had groups such as the Oath Keepers, law enforcement, current and former law enforcement officials who take a pledge to uphold the Constitution in their view, not as it might be interpreted by the courts or their superiors. We've had other radical right groups, the Proud Boys, a new group called the Alt Knights, come to college campuses really raring for a fight. My sympathy goes out to the university's officials at Berkeley because they have been faced with an increasingly incendiary situation. It's one of the reasons why I think it's really quite important for public officials at all levels, people in our churches, our synagogues, and our mosques, to do what they can to tamp down the rhetoric and really speak out on behalf of the values of our democracy.
One of the problems that I have is that there is an expectation that the university handles it. The handling of it means that you have resources to be able to send, and those resources know what to do. Particularly for the public university, and particularly for the University of California, there is a constant battle with the legislature over money.
Yes.
So the resources are not always what they might be. Does anyone on the panel have an idea, if you accept what Mr. Cohen has said, how should a university handle this?
If I can speak to, if I can speak briefly to that, I appreciate the resource constraints. I teach at UC, we're aware of the resource constraints. Yeah. This having been said, while we're fortunate to have UC Police Department, we also are in a city, and perhaps there are some...
But that's Berkeley.
Yes, and I would think that Berkeley Police Department will also be able and should be willing to lend police officers to help out if we are in a position where our police departments are unable to protect free speech, whether at universities or otherwise, then yes, indeed, we are in a very bad position. But my sense is...
Let me,
yes.
Professor, let me just understand what you're saying. No matter who comes, no matter what disturbance, the university has to be prepared to handle it. It's the problem for the university. That's the argument you're making. You're making the argument that a speaker that might fulminate a big problem should never be refused. They ought to be able to come. Whatever the problem is, it ought to be handled.
Senator, I'm always hesitant to say should never. There always are extraordinary circumstances. What if somebody's planted a bomb?
Well, to me, the extraordinary circumstance is when people come in black uniforms and hit other people over the head. That's an extraordinary circumstance.
Right, and that cannot be enough to justify suppression of those whom they came to try to suppress. That it's not just the university, it's the government. It's the job of the government. I'm not a big believer in large jobs for the government, but one important job of the government is to prevent violence, and to prevent violence without suppressing free speech. So I do think that between the, let's say my own UCLA, between the UCP Police
You
Department...
don't think we learned a lesson at Kent State way back when?
If I may, as the one person in this room who's actually had to make these kinds of decisions,
Please.
We are in the business of educating at a university, but we don't have the resources of a town, of a city at our disposal, either literally a budget to call upon or a city to turn to say, you need to take this one over right now. So these are always judgment calls that are made. I think the way to start with this is with a strong presumption in favor of the speech, particularly if it's speech that's coming from a student group who's invited somebody. If an outside group wishes to come to campus, that's a different set of issues, certainly for a private university, to a certain extent even for a public university. But always then a judgment call to try to find a way to get to yes on a speech. Perhaps you even have to have it closed and have it available for closed circuit. There are a lot of ways in which the university can think about this. But the suggestion to universities, and it's not just public universities, private universities that are resource constrained as well, that we have the resources to throw at all of these problems is a vastly exaggerated notion of what universities can do. It's putting more at the university's doorstep. So I think if you start with the presumption in favor of finding a way to get to the program, and only if that can be overcome, then you don't have a program on campus.
No matter how radical, offensive, biased, prejudiced, fascist the program is, you should find a way to accommodate it.
What I would say in response to that, Senator Feinstein, is that if we're talking about the substance of the program, not the danger and credible threats, but the substance of the program, then yes, then I do think that the program, if a student group invites, then they should be able to. However, I would say a flat rule of mine was if a speaker comes to campus, he or she better be prepared to answer questions. And what I would tell supporters, donors, alumni who would say, how can you have so-and-so speak on campus? I would say, trust my kids. Trust my kids to ask them hard questions, to ask them pointed questions. That's how we'll get to the truth.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.